Well, see, this is what happens when you're live. It was like you thought I had to go out and feed a goat or something, so we just took a little bit of time. But I'm telling you, folks, it's the stars that are in charge of all of this, because if the planets don't align, then the signals don't come through. We've got our end covered here. But what we can't control is how the signals run. We just simply can't. And which is the reason that a lot of people prefer to put it on a video, and then you're in a little bit tighter control. But I swear, it's what makes the world go round, my friends. It's what makes the world go round. So anyway, we're delighted to be with you. Now, I'm not sure where we were and what was said and what you heard, so let's just start all over and say that what we're going to be doing is working directly from your patterns, and consequently, you'll see that your patterns are all written in two methods. They're written in specialty rulers, and they are also written in traditional calculations. You, the driver, gets to decide the method you use. And there are times, even though you know I love the specialty rulers, there are truly times that I might cut, if I need something very weird, I might actually even cut it traditionally. And as piecers and patchworkers, I think it's so important for you to know more than one way to get a job done, and then you choose at the time you're ready to develop that project, you choose the method that fits your life at that time. So even though a lot of you know that I love to work with AccuQuilt, and there are times that when I want a multitude of something, I will definitely slide over and use that because it saves me time. But then if it comes along and I only need one really weird something, I might even go to traditional calculations. So the way we're going to try to pull this one off is in this session, because we're going to be dealing primarily with squares, that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the program, how we're going to lay it out, what we're going to do with this quilt, and what your choices are. And many of you know that I am a firm believer in there's no right way to get it done. You do what works for you. I have my preferred method. I would hope you have your preferred method, and we certainly don't have to agree on which one is the best. What I think is the best is what gets the job done for you with the least amount of stress. That's how I consider it a job well done. But I do pretty much exclusively work with specialty rulers because I have found they save me a boatload of time. So we'll be looking at, and you can see a little bit of the Choir Voices quilt behind me, because that's in the beginning when we first did this program, which was quite a few years ago. At the end of it, I thought, well, gosh, wouldn't it be fun if I had taken an element from each one of these 12 women and created a standalone quilt. That's how this quilt came about. It was by no means supposed to be the award-winning best quilt I've ever made. It was just a compilation of all of these elements that lived within this study program that we did over a year with a lot of shops around the country, and then those shops had their customers in as students, and that's how we worked through this in the beginning. The reason for, I tried to explain this to you guys, I think, on the Stay-cation page. The reason we decided to do a clearance and close out a lot of things is, I'm telling you, this pandemic has changed, I think, the way a lot of us are looking at things. And while I would have loved to have been working more than I have been, I must tell you, I have loved having time to do nothing, which I haven't done nothing. I've been busy most all of that time, but I have realized that there can be another life after this, and that I am going to cut way back, especially on travel. But I want to be in front of you a little bit more, so I'm going to take advantage of doing some of these things. So let's take a look. Brian, can you put that quilt up that we're going to talk about, that the Choir Voices quilt, real quick, so I can just kind of address. Now, hopefully you have page 1 of your little handout. Now, when you look at the quilt, for those of you who went through the Civil War Legacy program with us, you're going to see some similarities, even though the time frame wasn't near the same. But you can see that I have separated that quilt into rows. So you can clearly see you have a row 1, So as you look at the top, see how that row 1, you got A, B, C, D, E, F creating row 1. Now we took the time, actually Brian took the time, I just talked about it, at the right side of that where we told you what row 1 should finish. So the goal in that is to help you determine if you want to change anything. That's what you're after, is an 18 by 48 rows. So when row 1 is done, it should be 18 by 48. And then as we move down, row 2 is this size, and row 3 downloads. So certainly all you have to do is say, how do I find that? And we'll make sure you get all of that information. So when we look at what we're going to be doing first, we're going to look at the Kaye Nation is the first block that we're going to do. And I am going to often refer you back because we're looking at squares, and I mean, a square is the simplest thing you can sew together, of course. And so I'm not going to sew and do much cutting tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit more about planning and laying out and what we're going to do with it. So if you look at the Kaye Nation, the quilt that you see is all of the blocks, and the quantity of those blocks lives within your pattern, the sizes lives within your pattern. We are only going to make one of those blocks in this session. Now, I'm telling you, there's a couple of you that have already posted, and I just love it when you guys, get on that horse right off the bat, and you've already got 4 blocks done. For those of you who like to play with how blocks can be maneuvered, this will be one of the most fun blocks to play with. For any of you that are familiar with log cabin setup, we call it the styles that a log cabin are constructed in. There's things called field and furrows where all the rows just run on the diagonal. Then there's the blocks like you're looking at an X and an O. So when you set 4 blocks together forming one direction, you get an O, and then you form them the other direction, and you get that X. That takes 4 of the Kaye Nation blocks to execute that. So if this is a quilt that you go, wow, I am going to make that quilt, that's for sure. And the block lives in your number I in your layout. So if you look at your second page, and your I in your layout is your Kaye Nation block. So you go, okay, maybe I do want to make that quilt, but for right now, I'm just going to make a block. This is our goal every time we look at one of these, is where are we going to put it? Are we going to do the finishing work? And if you remember, I referred to this often in the Civil War Legacy program, where I said, if I ask you to frame it or square it off, you might want to wait and do that when you are confident about where it's going to live in the quilt. Because in some cases, you are going to be able to move these letters around and position them, like I had to move a couple. I have the whole quilt top made, all the blocks. And I ended up, and when I sew it together, I'll reposition a few of them, only because the color was better in one place than the other. But if you don't frame them out or add sashing to them, you will have more flexibility in where you put them. If you decide you're going to make it exactly like we are walking it down to you with the ABC layout, then don't worry about it and just do what it says. Now, before we look at the first block, I want to look at the rulers real quick, and I want to tell you one of my pet peeves about cutting squares. A lot of people believe that as long as you have a rectangle ruler, you don't need anything else. And I am telling you that I am an avid fan of my rectangle ruler. But I would never attempt to make squares and 4 patches and 9 patches, especially when these rascals get little, like they're going to here in a few minutes. I want a square ruler. I don't care what size square ruler you use, but I love the 4-inch square. But if you have a size that works for you and you're happy with it, because for those of you who don't know, I want to show you one little quick thing here, and we're going to pull the overhead camera so I can show you this. Now, I just cut a little rectangle. I used my rectangle ruler, laid it down like yo, and cut it. Then you turn it and you need a 1.5 inch. Now, depending on the size you're looking for, this may look easier. But if I wanted a 1.25, then it's muddier. I can't get a box around that assures me that I am cutting all these equal. But when I pick my square ruler up and lay it down, it sits right on there, and there's a box right there. If you can see, that fabric kind of sits in that box, and I'm telling you, if you just do this exercise yourself with any size strip, take your rectangle ruler and try to square it off, and then lay a square ruler on it and look at the difference. Because I can't really mess this guy up right now. I can go south right here. When you are looking at a quilt like this Carrie Nation quilt, for example, that's got 19 million squares in it, all you got to be off is 7 or 8. You don't have to be, I mean, if you have cut them and they are out of square, you can trust me when I tell you that when that quilt is completed, it'll be pretty clear which one's out of square. And you can't press it back in, and I don't even think you can pray it back in. So to me, when I'm cutting squares, I am going to always cut my strips with my strip cutter, and I'm going to rely on one of my squares. I use the 4 and the 7 often on these smaller elements because it's so much easier to pick these folks up and work with them. So the rulers that you're going to work with are going to be strictly up to you. The only other one that we're going to talk about in this session is the half square triangle, and that'll be the last block we do. And we know that many of you have ordered rulers, and sadly we are completely out of the quarter square triangle in the large size. Gone, no more. You may find them in stock somewhere at a store, but currently I don't have any and don't have, well, that's not true. We have a few left that are in the sets. So for those of you who have purchased sets or are looking at the set, the large quarter square triangle does live in that set. But in this case, I'm going to be working when I need triangles smaller, and those are again part of the 40% off. So for those of you who think, oh man, maybe I do want those, this is a great buy because I rarely use a quarter square more than 4 inches anyhow, but I have it, so when I need it, it's there. So now I'm going to slide the rulers out of the way. Now see, normally I'd have time to stop and get a drink and talk about what I'd said wrong, but now we just have to segue right back into it. So let me pick up my Carrie Nation block to start with. Now, as you look at your pattern, you should be able to, and I'm hoping all of you, I know there's a few people that ordered that may not have gotten theirs yet, but hopefully you'll be able to walk along with us, and then you can certainly go back and watch this segment again. But as you look at your elements, you have 4 A's that are the half size, so whatever B is, A's half of it, and when I put 4 A's together, I should have an element that remains the exact same size as B. Now, I get a question a lot about, do I have to make it that size? You certainly should know that answer. You make it any size you want to. I've just done the math for you. So if you decide that you want to skinny it up or fatten it up, that's strictly up to you, but you have to redo your math. And of course, we don't get into specialty rulers here because squares can be cut with any ruler that is accurate. So I'm going to cut 4 A's, and then I'm going to put those together, and then I'm going to do my B's. Now the coloration, if you look at the one that I've got laying on the table here, it's a little different than the one that's in the quilt behind me, which is a little different than the one that's in your handout of what is in the choir quilt. So there's just, the coloring of this is strictly up to you. And what's so neat about, what I love about the Carrie Nation is when it's turned on point, and I'm going to turn this one on point, it completely changes the way this block reads. So if you just wanted to whip out a quick table runner, I'm telling you, 3 of these little blocks and side set triangle, throw that together, and you know, Thanksgiving is like day after tomorrow, I think, and then Christmas a couple of days after that. You could have this done in fall or holiday colors, and this is where I want you to plan that this isn't just this choir quilt. This is a whole lot of choices for you to be playing with. Now, if you look at your little cheat sheet, which is page 3, which is where we give you the explanation of the ABCs. That is something that I highly encourage you to spend some time looking at prior to our sessions so that you understand what you're supposed to do with something. So just for grins, let's look at I. And it says Carrie Nation block, 12 inches, and it says finished. In other words, when you sew that block together, it's going to lay on the table at 12 and a half. But if it's on the table at 12 and a quarter, then it's going to finish 11 and 3/4. It's not going to finish 12. So it's really important when you sew this many squares together that you are consistent with that 1/4 inch seam. Now, there are a lot of people that subscribe to what difference does it make as long as they all come out the same size. Well, they can't hardly all come out at the same size. If you sew the little 4 patch together incorrectly, it won't fit this fellow unless you trim this fellow. So you're going to have to get that 1/4 inch worked out, and to me the easiest way to do it is do it on a square. Because once you can sew the square consistently, and I'm telling you, it's a happy day when I can put that little 4 patch together and it joins that big square and they're perfectly aligned. That tells me I'm going to have a really sharp block when it's all said and done. But then after it says, it'll tell you that it is a 12 inch finish. Then it says cut 2, 9, and 3/8 inch squares, cut in half, add to the corners, turning the block on point. And if you look down in the lower right hand corner of that page, it has a diagram of how we square off a block. So how we end up doing it. And one of the things that I always recommend you do is when you start putting your corners on, do you see how when I fold that corner back, it sits right in that seam right there? When you cut these, let's just say you decide to cut them 10 inches. Overcutting is not a problem for me when you're putting corners on. When you do, whatever that corner is, lay it down into the center seam like this. Now, if you sew it like this, where it's not in that center, it is so easy for you to end up where your corners do this instead of stay like this. So pay attention to that when you do decide to put that on. Now, because our half square triangle ruler only goes to 12 inch block, and I turn it on point, it will always be 17 inches finished. And that's just something like 1 and 1 is 2. So if you make a lot of 12 inch blocks, know that anytime you decide to turn those rascals on point, they're going to finish 17. Right there is my math. If the whole thing is 17, half of it is what? 8 and a half.
Now, somebody had asked if they can use the side set triangle ruler for that.
Now, there's such a smarty pants. Who asked that question, Brian?
Margaret Weber.
Margaret Weber, you're just brilliant. I'm telling you, that's exactly what I would do. But you're just so in charge of.
Tell them what they said, because I don't know if they heard me.
Yeah, because what Brian said, that Margaret asked, could you use the side set triangle? The reason you can is that side set triangle, and I'm going to talk about it in some other sessions. It has the ability to take any size strip you cut up to 12 inches and cut you an accurate half square and an accurate 1/4 square from it. The lines aren't there. That's not what it was designed for. But when I cut these, I absolutely use the side set triangle to cut anything larger than my largest half square triangle ruler. So yes, so what I could do is just say, okay, this is going to be, I need something that's going to finish 7. Traditional math says add 7/8 of an inch to that, cut a square and cut it in half. Ruler math says only add a 1/2 an inch to it and use the ruler, because the ruler compensates for those 3/8 inch differences. So when you take a square and cut it in half, you have seam allowances added for both of those elements, which means you must add 7/8 to what you want. So if I wanted this to be 10 inches, 10 and 10, I just cut it 10, and I'd add 7/8 to whatever it was that I wanted. I tend to overcut when I'm doing this kind of thing. It's like my side set triangles. I tend to overcut because it gives me some flexibility to be sure that I don't have a droopy corner. Because when you cut these so precise and you sew just a cat hair out of alignment, what you're going to find is you're going to have a corner that ends up doing this. And that is just difficult to deal with to keep your quilt square. So when you decide to square this off, if you already know this is, oh look, Brian just popped up a picture of the side set. I'm going to tell you folks, for those of you who haven't seen some of the earlier videos we did, the very first time we ever did a collection of this ruler, I actually called it a cat poker in a video, and I actually got hate mail about that because people going, I just can't believe you'd poke a cat. Well, that's just the way, I mean, it's because it got that little point on it, and I said, if you're sewing and your cat's sitting on your sewing machine, just poke the cat. Well, people just got all up in the dither, and then later I called it a husband poker. It's funny, nobody seemed to care. Nobody just seemed to care at all. So I always love to make the joke about the fact that y'all like your cat better than your man, apparently. But anyway, we digress because we're on Facebook. Well, we're actually, and you aren't confident about where it's going to live. Just see that it lays 12.5, and then your directions are clear on this page of what to do with it if you want it to live in that position. Now, if you want it to live somewhere else in this quilt, then you have to study this diagram to find a spot that you can put it in without disrupting your rows. Of course, you can totally set this quilt different and use the blocks. So I don't think I really need to talk to you too much. I am going to kind of show you on the back of this what I really look for when I finish anything with 4 patches is a block that is clearly laying in order and these seams aren't rotated. And folks, that's not a miracle, it's a plan. Making one block is pretty simple. When you're making multiple blocks of this, you have got to pay attention when those corners come together. You'll have to make some with the seams going one way and some with the seams going the other way in order to be able to put those blocks where they kiss each other and go back together to form that larger unit. So sewing it, I'm telling you, we're going to put up on, you know, I'm telling you that Brian's a genius at all this stuff. So he's found a way to go in and we're going to post all of these, oh gosh, Brian, what's that magical word that I'm supposed to know? Links are in the video description below, folks, because I can't remember. I hardly know my own name some of the days. But this way, instead of me sitting here, because you know I'm going to ramble on and on, instead of me taking time to sew and cut these, we've got a link for exactly how I cut and sewed a 4-pack. Exactly what I do, exactly how I finger, a whole 9 yards. So that is our Miss Carrie Nation. Now, a little bit of history on Carrie Nation. I've had a couple people say to me, I see that her name was spelled C-A-R-R-I-E when she was born, and then we have it spelled as C-A-R-R-Y. It is reported, and I'm assuming it's true because it's in history books, that she was born Carrie, C-A-R-R-I-E, but she decided when she went on her mission of, you know, going around and chopping up saloons and all that other stuff, she decided that what she would do is change her spelling with a Y because she was going to carry the nation. So that was why she ended up and changed the name. So I often spell it both ways because I can. So let's put Carrie, and now let me show you a couple of real quick little quilts. If you've got a little one in your life that just needs a little dog quilt, look how cute this little guy is. Now these little fellows right here are about 3/4 of an inch, maybe a half. Well, why don't I just check how big that is? Oh my goodness, it is a 1/2 inch finished. So these little guys finish a 1/2 inch, which means that big guy would finish 1 inch. And it is actually 4 blocks. Oh gosh, maybe it's even more than that. Well, who knows? It's how many ever it is. This is really, gosh, this quilt's probably was about the same time that we did the program, and I do have a great, people say I have a new granddaughter. Well, they're all new, aren't they, when we get them for the first time? But anyway, I've got a 2.5-year-old great granddaughter, and probably this one's going to end up in her stash at some point. Now, for those of you who like a little bit larger, take a look at this Kaye Nation, and this comes to address the issue where I've told you that I'm putting 4 blocks together, and at this point, these 4 blocks are going to form an O. But I could have turned them the different direction and got a totally different block. The other thing that I could have done is had all 4 of them running on a diagonal. The settings for this block are as varied as you can find settings for log cabins. And that is some of the traditional barn raisings, and that sort of terminology would help you be able to decide what you wanted to do with your Kaye Nation. Okay, did I just have a wore you out yet? Brian, is there anybody while I'm folding up? See, this is normally when I'd stop, get a drink of water.
Everybody really likes what the quilts.
Yay! Oh, we just love, because you know I have fun. I think growing up, I believe I've got to had fun in a mud hole. I think I actually did. I don't really remember that. Oh, I do remember a funny story about a mud hole. Brian, you'll love this. This is about your wife. When the kids were little, when their children were little, my grandchildren were little, I had them, we were at a family reunion in Kentucky, which is, of course, where I was born and raised. And Julie's a fabulous mother, but boy, she just kept those kids, they were just spotless all the time. And I had them, and it had rained, and I let them play in a mud hole. They were a mess. I'm telling you, they had mud from one end of them to the other. I'm not sure that they knew exactly what that mud was all about. I believe did I have to do a timeout on that, Brian? Do you remember?
Probably.
Oh, gee, see, well, anyway, that's what mud holes are, fun things. Now, let's take a look at Mary Todd Lincoln. Now, Mary Todd Lincoln is your A block, so as you go to your little layout sheet, it will tell you that Mary Todd Lincoln is a 6 3/4 inch finished block, and you are going to do it exactly like the pattern to get that, but then you're going to sash it where it lays 9.5 on the table, hence the words unfinished. So when we say unfinished, please know that we expect when it gets in that quilt, it will be 1/2 inch smaller. When we say finished, it will actually be 1/2 inch smaller than it is when it lays on the table. Now, let's look at the quilt that's laying behind me, and we'll show you a picture of the pattern front. And of course, on the back of the pattern front, you actually have a full shot of it. This is not a quilt that Mary Todd Lincoln made, to my knowledge, although it is from the time frame. It is a very fragile quilt. It's one of my favorite antique quilts that I actually own. And there's loads and loads of those little squares where the fabric has just fragmented away. And it doesn't, well, I've taken it with me a few times, but it never travels where it's in a suitcase or anything like that. It's in the front seat with me if it does travel. And it's as fragile as it is right now, the likelihood of it going on the road anymore is slim to none. Now, when you guys are looking at this, look how bright those greens are. That's a green that we know held its color amazingly well. And when it was done, many of these colors would have been brighter. But when I finished and was ready to decide which blocks lived in this choir quilt, I thought, why don't we just do one of the little Mary Todd Lincoln blocks? And that's all this is. So if I turn this over, it's my 9 patch. Now, we made 4 patches for Carrie. We're making 9 patches on this one. And I'm telling you, this is, again, what I am looking for when I look at the back of this quilt. And typically, when I make 9 patches, I sew them in rows, east and west rows. So I sew 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So let's do like yo, yo, yo. Then if I decide to set it to another 9 patch, here I've got a plain block in between, which will help me with my seam orientation. Had I not had that guy, I'd have to given some thought to how I sew these. And I have made a couple of quilts where I probably have thousands of these guys that sit next to each other. When I do that, I absolutely look at it and say, wait a minute, I've got to have an A block and a B block, and they have got to be opposing. That's the only way I'm ever going to get those to kiss up when I put them together. So in this one block, it isn't an issue. And in the mother quilt, the maker that did this quilt obviously put in a plain block equal to the size of this. And I've had quite a few people say, well, why did you make it a weird size? Because that's what the original maker made it. And who knows, could have been a square of cardboard. I don't know how that was made, but it's pretty clean for the technique that they used. It is all hand-pieced and it is hand-quilted. And it's quite a valuable quilt, even though it's in a fragile condition. It is because of the quality, the fabrics that live in it. And I am the one who decided that I would call it a Mary Todd Lincoln quilt. So nowhere in the history of documentation does this block live, to my knowledge, that was called this. I just decided that this was someone that I wanted to honor with a quilt, and so I chose one of the antique quilts to do that. Now, if you look at your the description under A, it's going to tell me what to sash this to. So if you go back and look at that row 1, let's look at row 1 in that. And look how whatever A is, B's got to be. So B has got to equal A, and C, the length of C has got to equal A and B. So when you're planning, keep in mind that if you don't want this to live where it is, let's just say you decide to make 2 Mary Todd Lincolns and dump B. Of course you can. You can do anything you want as long as you work on your math, and I'm anxious to see what you guys do that is so very different than what I did, and I'm sure it's going to be fabulous because y'all usually outshine me. And I mean, if you aren't watching what's going on the Staycation page, we have loads and loads and loads of people still making and finishing their quilts, and there's some stunners out there, folks. So go back and take the time to really go through, because it's like a whole movie of fabulous quilts. Has anybody got a question on Mary Todd? She was a little crazy, I think, because people, I mean, you know, there's a whole lot of stories running around about her. And if you read these, the women's history stories, and I hope you do, I mean, she lost children, and I mean, this was I'm telling you, well, we're in a tough time right now, aren't we? But Mary Todd Lincoln, her path was not an easy one for sure. And as the historians have written about her, and I've read most everything I could get my hands on that's written about her, I have great empathy for what she endured and what was dealt to her. And hence, this is why I decided to do a block for her. So are there any questions about us where we are so far, Brian? Or am I just ahead of the game? Yay, I'm not good. You know, I'm going to segue and do something real quick for fun. Look, I want to show you. Now, you've already probably seen as you look at what I was working on, and especially if I were to grab this, you'll see that I've started doing quite a bit with this print. And this is an earlier one out of my collection a long time ago. And I just thought, I love this because I love the way it cuts up, and you're going to see it in a lot of my blocks. Well, then the other day I was running through my fabric, and then I found this one, and I went, oh my goodness, I love that. And see, even if I decided to do this, I still could pull this off. So when I've had a lot of questions about what would you do for fabric, many times when I very first start working with a quilt, I might choose my border, which a lot of you do, and I refer to that often as a main, and I choose it, and then by the time I get the quilt done, there's something else that's better. So I would encourage you to relax about the border unless you're choosing it so that you have a main theme to work through all of your blocks. But don't be afraid to make a change at the very end, because there's new stuff coming out. I mean, there it is. See, that's the other thing. Normally I'd say stop and I'd go look for this. Your Harriet Tubman is your G on your paperwork, on your little handout. And on G, it tells you that it will be a 12-inch block finished once we make the block. And then we are going to square it off and turn it on point, just exactly like we did. Carrie Nation, bottom right-hand corner, shows you that diagram. Now, let me show you the Carrie Nation, or the Harriet Tubman without the frame on it, just so I can kind of show you something. One of the things when I'm looking at a block like this, I love the fact that when this turns on point, I know it's going to be way prettier. Now, we didn't have room to put all the quilts up behind me, but Brian, did you put up a picture of the Harriet Tubman quilt? I think we do, of the cover. Let's look at that a second. I love the block, and this is a block that I actually named for her. And as you look at it, you all know that, or hopefully you all know that Harriet Tubman was known for the Underground Railroad. She was called the conductor on the Underground Railroad for helping slaves escape. This center block is actually what is known as the Underground Railroad block. And again, that is going to be a link that you will be able to go back to and see how we sewed some of these elements, and especially how we got this half square triangle, which is the first time we've put triangles in. So I wanted to get this one in because it squares and rectangles, and in trying to figure out how all these blocks would play together, I've kind of chosen the elements that live within the block, and that's how I determined which one would fit into what program. So this is actually called Underground Railroad, and then this frame that's around the outside is referred to in many, many patchwork blocks as Mother's Fancy. So I sort of combined elements from Mother's Fancy with an element of the Underground Railroad. And, that's how blocks came about. I mean, there are some people that just get so uptight about who invented what and when did this come along. And the square's been around for a long time, I think. The half square triangle's been around for a long time. I don't think anybody can lay claim to having invented that. I think it's very difficult to say you invented 4-patch or 9-patch. And I don't even lay claim to I invented the block that was called Harriet Tubman. I just compiled the elements that live within the block that I call Harriet Tubman. Everyone out there could do the same thing. If you guys took elements and put them together with something else, and you're going to have your, somebody that's your best friend that's, an award-winning quilter is going to tell you you can't do that. I want somebody to tell me what book that's in that says I can't do that. Now, what you can't do, if you're going to enter quilts in for show and stuff, you have to be a little bit tighter about things you do. And certainly you have freedom to play with things, but be careful about what you're going to call it, and be careful about how you're going to do it if you're going to enter it in a show. I'm never going to do that. So for me, I do what makes me happy. So now when I did this block, I decided not to put that main fabric in it because I already had it in quite a few. But I think I told you folks in one of the posts I did on the Stay-cation page that I really wanted this to be a patriotic quilt. Just because of what we've been going through, and then it was an election year as well. With all of that, I thought, and I made that blue quilt with the Civil War legacy, but I thought I want a blue, but I want a little red in it. And then I couldn't help but get a little gold in it. But it's pretty, when I have all of these blocks up on the wall together, it really looks very patriotic to me, and that's what my goal was. Now let me show you one other thing. Remember what I told you when we were going to put your corners on, which is the information is in that lower right-hand corner. When I pull this corner to the center, it's got to sit right in that center line right there. That is how I position it, and then because it's pretty good size, if you feel like you need to, throw a couple of pins in there. I don't, but because if you let this shift this much out of alignment and you cut it precise, you're going to not have 1/4 of an inch out there. So I would encourage you on those elements that tell you to frame it out, that you don't worry about cutting to something in 3/8, that you just maybe go on and cut to the chase and cut a 10-inch. Cut it in half, and or like Margaret said, use your side set triangle ruler. And then what you'll have is extra out there so that when you trim it, it would be exactly what you needed it to be. Now, much like our earlier quilt program that we did, there are places in this that you can salvage an error. So I want you to start thinking about that. If this was not what it's supposed to be, you know what your solution is. You just make it a little bit larger, and everything that lives in that row has to come up to that size. So let's just say that I'm supposed to be at 17 and I'm at 16. Well, I can get it up to 17 real easy, but let's say it's off, one of them's off 1/4 of an inch and one of them is off 1/2 an inch. That's one of the reasons that I love a setting like this that's kind of quirky, and things aren't the same size and they aren't handled the same way, because it lets me do what we have to do in life all the time, and that's make do. It helps me learn that if I'm off, it could have been my sewing, it could have been my cutting, it just could have been the weather, could have been the moon, could have been a lot of things. But if you know how to make that work, which I'm sure the lady that made the Maritime Lincoln knew all of that and felt like it was not going to be a big deal. Now, when you're sewing your half square triangles, pay close attention to, because I know if this is a 12-inch block, this is 3 and this is 3, I know this is 6. So that's 2, 4, 6, 2. Each one of those guys would have been a 1.5 cut. This is a triangle, and this is when I'm going to come back right here with my little half square triangle, and I will have cut a strip 2.5, but if you don't have this, you've got to cut 2 7/8 and cross cut it so that you have seam allowance on both of those. Oh, let me show you this one. Look at this sweet little, and this is another really good example of how, even if you don't want to make a whole quilt and you want to make more than one block, there's 4 blocks and they're sashed, and in between the sashing is the same 9 patch that lives in the corner of those. And so the entire thing was there's just those 4 little triangles living in each block. And this was a long time ago, because I had a couple of hand quilters that did some work for me way back then. And gosh, you'd take 6 months to get your quilt back. And this one's hand quilted, and I just love it. And, so that was just another little fun thing in there. So, okay, do we have any questions, Brian? I'm supposed to be able to see these, but I don't know where they are. We're probably way over. Are we way over? I don't have it. Oh, yeah, we're gone. I said,
3 minutes.
oh, gosh, I said we'll only be on this about 15, 20 minutes. Look here, 45 minutes, and some of y'all have probably already gone to sleep. The beautiful thing about this is when it goes up, you can just fast forward and cut half what I'm saying out if you feel like it. So, no burning questions, Brian?
Somebody says you're the queen of everything.
Ellen's best buddy. She loved Mary Englebright. I think Mary Englebright's the one who did the queen of everything, but I'll take that, Margaret. Thanks loads. Well, if you don't have any questions, what we're going to do is, I don't know, it's probably time to go eat a bite or something, but here's what I want you to know. Please post on the Staycation page. Whatever I don't get to an answer, there's a load of people out there who's going to answer it for you. I anticipate that we're going to hear quite a few different questions and scenarios, and when sometime this next week, I'll kind of post which 3 blocks we're going to do next, so you have a little bit of a heads up. You can pull fabrics if you want to. Please do share with us exactly what you're working on. We love to see it. We love to know what you're doing. Please take time to look for, because everything that we're going to tell you, Brian's going to put the links on there for you, and they will live right below all of this. So everything's going to be easy to find. I'm sure there'll be things that we'll wish we had said when we're all said and done, and I'll probably type you another, like 16 letters or something.
Somebody did ask, what's the advantage of the triangle ruler?
The advantage of the half square triangle ruler is pretty cut and dried. If you were to cut the triangles that live in the center of the Harriet Tubman block for the size you need, which is 2 inches finished, you would have to cut a 2 7/8 inch strip. Loads of rulers don't even have an 1/8 of an inch mark on it. So how are you going to cut a 2 7/8 inch strip to cross cut a 2 7/8 inch square to cross cut that in half? Specialty rulers calculate on the height of the unit. So that triangle unit, if I look at, let me pull this out, whatever height this unit is, all you need to know is add a 1/2 inch to it and pick up your half square ruler. Otherwise, you have to know the height, and then you have to add 7/8 of an inch to it, cut a square, cut it in half. So if you're speed cutting 30, 40, 50, 60 of these, and you're having to cut 7/8, you're going to be a long time on that. It's just a lot longer. And because very few of the early strip cutters, which is what I call a rectangle ruler, very few of them had 1/8 inch markings on them. And those 1/8 inch markings aren't clear as to how to spot them. So I would say pop back in and look at some of our links below this where we talk about when we did the ruler DVD, where we actually talk about the value of and the elements they cut and why we prefer one method over the other. But make sure you understand we don't require you to do either. If you do the traditional method, it's very successful and has worked for many, many years, but you'll work a little harder because it's more difficult to cut those triangles that way. That's the best explanation I can have for you. Please post your questions. Gosh, we got to get out of here. It's dark as all get out here in Indiana. Please be safe. Take care of yourself. Let's hope that we all prosper and get through this pandemic, and it looks like we're making some headway, even though some of the states are having a surge, but I'm just staying home. If you noticed, I did get a haircut. Sometime next week. We don't know if it's going to be the same day or not. So have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.